If we hadn't done that at that time, I very much doubt I'd be talking to you today, because, as you know, there was accommodation for less than 800 people in the lifeboats, and she was carrying 2,200. So it was a question as who was there in time to get into one of the all too few lifeboats.
The Titanic is one of the most well-known ships in the world, and obviously for a less than great reason. The sinking of the Titanic is one of the most famous events of the 1900s and has fascinated people ever since that fateful day. While I am absolutely sure the entire ship was filled with fear on this terrible day, on today's list I will be covering just a few of the scary things that happened on the Titanic. Starting off this list in our number 10 spot. In 1898, a book called Futility was released by an author named Morgan Robertson. This book tells the story of a large ship named the Titan. The Titan sets out for its first sail but encounters and strikes an iceberg. This certainly sounds eerily familiar, doesn't it? Considering this book was released in 1898 and the real-life event of the Titanic sinking happened in 1912, there are many people who believe that this novel predicted this fateful day. It's most likely a very strange coincidence, but man, it really is weird. Even with the names being so close, let alone how the rest of the story just matches up so well. Maybe Morgan Robertson is a time traveler or some kind of prophet, but if he was, I guess it would have been kind of rude to just write a book about it rather than, I don't know, warn someone. Moving on to number 9. This is something that I actually didn't know, but apparently the entire accident of the Titanic totally could have and should have been avoided. In my head, I felt like this iceberg just kind of came up out of nowhere and surprised them, but that is not the case at all. The crew had received 6 warnings about the iceberg before the collision. While the first few warnings were received by the captain, not all of them were, and it's not totally clear why. Although the crew knew about the icy conditions of the water, they didn't slow down much, which some have called a reckless decision, but apparently this was standard practice at the time, so I suppose you can't blame them much. The final warning, however, was received from a ship that had halted for the night due to an ice field a few miles away, and when the message was being relayed to the captain, he cut it off and said to shut up as he was working Cape Race. Moving on to number 8. This is a well-known fact that happened on that fatal night, but one that most definitely needed to be included on this list. We know how passionate musicians can be, and we know how healing music is for a lot of people. While I am absolutely sure that there was nothing that could be done to completely erase people's worries about what was going on, the ship's orchestra did what they could, which was play music. The 8 orchestra members continued to play as the ship sank in order to try and keep spirits up, I'm sure for other passengers as well as themselves. They all unfortunately passed away in the sinking of the ship, and they played until they couldn't anymore, which I think is horribly sad, but also very beautiful and heroic of them. I'm sure that their heroism helped a lot of people who were also in this terrible situation, and I'm glad that their acts have been remembered even still. Moving on to number 7. I know we talked about how not a lot was done with the warnings that were given about the icy water conditions, but when the iceberg was actually spotted, the chief officer received this warning and he ordered the helmsman to turn the wheel. Apparently, this was actually a huge mistake, but it's unlikely that they would have known at the time. Researchers now believe that if they hadn't have turned the wheel, the ship might not have sunk. The ship itself had bulkheads in the bow, so it is very likely that had the ship collided head-on with the iceberg, it actually would have been fine. They say that a head-on collision would have either stopped the ship from sinking at all, or it would have at least sunk a lot more slowly, which would have given more time for people to be rescued. I suppose this is just one case of hindsight being 2020. Moving on to number 6. 2 of the first-class passengers who were on the ship were elderly couple ISIDOR and Ida Stratus. When the ship started to sink and lifeboats were being boarded, attendants were ushering Ida onto one of the lifeboats, but of course without her husband, since women and children were being rescued first. Ida, however, refused to leave her husband, and Isidore refused to be rescued before other men. Instead, they both chose to stay on the ship and they went down together. Ida said, "I will not be separated from my husband. As we have lived, so will we die. together. Survivors who witnessed their love last saw the pair standing on the deck with their arms around each other. This love story is incredibly tragic, but also just a testament to how much they loved each other. I'm very glad that they had each other in those very frightening moments. Moving on to number 5. The ship was carrying around 2,208 passengers at the time of the incident. That is obviously a lot of people. Before the ship set sail, however, in the preparation, they didn't want to clutter the deck, and the decision was made to reduce the number of lifeboats on board to just 20 with an additional 4 that were collapsible. This is only enough for half of the passengers on board, even if they were able to launch all of them. This decision was obviously extremely detrimental, and it is possible that many more people could have been saved if it wasn't for this. I wonder if anyone who was on the ship at the time knew about this previous decision that had been made, because that would be so irritating. I think throughout this list it has become very clear that the safety preparations for this cruise were just not up to par, but I guess that is just a lesson learned for all of us. Moving on to number 4. The Titanic had a well-stocked bar, as it had 1,500 bottles of wine, 8,000 cigars, and 20,000 bottles of beer on board. One less than great thing about this is the fact that all of the alcohol was only reserved for first-class passengers. I suppose this isn't the worst thing in the world, as no one needs alcohol, but it certainly seems a little rude. Most of the people who passed away on the night that the Titanic sank didn't die from drowning, but rather the icy temperatures of the water. I mentioned the alcohol in the cold water because of one passenger named Charles. Charles was actually the baker on the ship, and when he found out that the ship was most definitely done for, he decided to indulge himself in the bar, as he was known to enjoy a whiskey or two. Considering he thought he was about to meet his end, he may have overindulged and found himself quite drunk actually. Well, after the ship sank, Charles was found 2 hours later, still treading water and relatively unscathed. It turns out that the alcohol slowed his heat loss, so he was able to survive the terribly cold water until he could be rescued. Who would have thought that getting drunk would actually turn out to save your life? Moving on to number 3. The time from the point where the ship actually hit the iceberg until the first lifeboats were launched was an entire hour. That is way too long when it is an emergency of this magnitude, which obviously leaves us wondering why. Well, as it turns out, a lot of people thought that the alarm bells were actually just a drill and they stayed inside where it was warm. This is already terrible, but what's even worse is that for people who didn't think it was a drill, they had absolutely no idea where to go or what to do in the case of an emergency. They had never done any lifeboat drills, so everyone was just panicking with nowhere to go. Due to this lifeboat delay, there wasn't enough time to launch all of the remaining lifeboats successfully. There were even 2 boats that never got launched at all. This is obviously terrible because there are so many people who potentially could have been saved had this delay never happened. I also just can't imagine how frightening it would be to be in the middle of that emergency with absolutely no direction at all. Moving on to number 2. John Jacob Astor was one of the first-class passengers on the ship that day. As the ship was sinking, he put his young wife on one of the lifeboats, and he was about to get in with her when he saw 2 absolutely terrified children standing behind him. He instead gave up his spot and let those 2 children on the boat, which is both noble, but also just the right thing to do. One of the Titanic survivors named Philip Mock saw John in one of his final moments. He saw him and his valet huddled together on one of the life rafts before they unfortunately froze in the cold water. This was indeed a very tragic event, but the positive news is that both his wife and the child that she was carrying at the time were able to make it to safety and survive the whole ordeal. I'm sure if John's spirit is still around somewhere, that is all he truly cared about at the end of the day. Moving on to number 1. Only 20 miles away from the location of the sinking Titanic was another boat called the SS Californian. This boat had stopped in order to avoid the ice, which was clearly a fantastic idea. What is pretty insane, however, is that the captain of this boat actually saw the emergency flares being set off on the Titanic, but he ignored them because he figured that they were company rockets. And to make this matter even worse, the SOS signals that the Titanic was sending out weren't even received until the next day because the radio operator on the SS Californian had already gone to sleep. By the time they heard these calls and arrived the next next day, everyone had unfortunately already passed away and they weren't able to save anyone. Who knows what could have happened had they taken those emergency signals seriously. It is obviously not their fault, but it does make you think. Alright guys, that has been our list for today. Thank you so much for checking it out. If you have any crazy stories that you know about things that happened on the Titanic, please let me know in the comments because I would love to hear them. I've been your host today, Olivia Kozlowski, and I'll see you next time. Bye! The ship itself had bulkheads in the bow, so it's in the bow. And I don't speak ship. I think it's bow, but I don't know. Do you know? God damn. I'm just gonna say the bow, and if people tell me that's wrong, then whatever. I was typing too fast. That doesn't make any sense at all. The previous decision that had been made because,